She had sneered at a soup kitchen volunteer just last week and called the neighborhood a blur of second-rate lives. The daughter of a billionaire laughed in silk and pearl at stories of hardship, never imagining her own beginning could walk into the room. The mansion sat on a quiet avenue, gates tall and polished, hedges trimmed into precise shapes. Inside, the chandeliers caught light and turned it into a hollow brightness that only made the silence louder. Sophie Harrington was 21, wore confidence like a second skin, and carried a disdain that smelled faintly of expensive perfume and the kind of boredom money admits to. Rosa arrived at 9 in the morning, holding a worn tote bag stitched back together in a dozen places and a small folder tied with twine. Her hands were calloused from work and tender from practice in holding fragile things. The staff warned the new housekeeper that the young miss had pushed people away, that psychologists and tutors had come and gone, and nothing softened Sophie. Doctors had given terms, and therapists had prescribed distance. No one had reached the place where Sophie started most mornings, refusing to touch anything that reminded her of the world beyond the gates. Rosa did not arrive with titles or grand answers. She arrived with a readiness to be present and with a question that sounded like an offer to listen. Something would change in that house because presence has a way of finding a seam where silence hides. Stay for the first room, the first photo, and the small, ordinary thing that made a proud girl remember she was someone else entirely. Prepare to feel a mix of anger and tenderness, because this is a portrait of shame, of rediscovery, and of how a hidden origin can become the doorway to belonging. If you like stories of unexpected healers and family remakes, stay with me. The foyer smelled of lemon polish and leather, clean in a way that tried to erase the trace of people. Portraits in heavy frames watched from the walls, faces frozen in stern smiles, their gold leaf catching the light like secrets. The staff were a small chorus of rituals. Sandra, the head housekeeper, smoothed tablecloths with mechanical grace. Carlos, the chef, kept a low hum of casserole pans and spice jars. Miguel, the gardener, carried the hush of dirt under his nails. Daniel, the chauffeur, checked his watch and his loyalty in the same movement. Each name marked a place in the house. Sandra, who had been there 20 years. Carlos, who cooked for celebrations no one quite enjoyed. Miguel, who knew where the sun lay on the lawn at 4. Daniel, who opened doors and closed them with equal care. There was also Eliza, Sophie's tutor, who kept lists and schedules, and Mr. Harrington, Sophie's father, who filled rooms with documents and empty apologies. The house presented itself like a museum of care taken from a distance. There were rugs that absorbed the echo of footsteps, curtains that softened the street noise, and a piano that sat untouched as if the idea of music was a memory left in the keys. Rosa learned the routes, the rituals, the places where a teacup was always kept warm and where a coat was always hung. She noticed the silence at the children's wing of the house where no laughter lived anymore. She smelled the faint perfume in Sophie's room that masked the absence of childhood objects. She felt the weight of the house's cleanliness, like an effort to keep out anything messy or real. Names began to weave into her mind like a map. Sandra with the sharp eyes, Carlos always testing a spoonful for balance, Miguel whispering to roses as if they answered, Daniel who kept a soft reserve, Eliza who corrected grammar even in apologies. The house belonged to routines, but not to warmth. That contrast would be the place Rosa would start to untie knots. They had tried everything. Medical specialists from downtown, a child psychologist whose office smelled of paper and earnestness, nutritionists who charted meals like maps to happiness. They had tried methods that came in glossy pamphlets and therapies that promised gradual restoration. Sophie's teachers had been called in, her pediatrician had been consulted despite her age, and a counselor had left a stack of coping exercises like a bouquet of instructions. Each attempt had arrived with the force of good intentions and left with the same result. Sophie retreated into a guarded quiet that looked like rudeness and sometimes like cruelty. The records spoke of sleeplessness and a refusal to sit at shared tables. There were clinical notes about boundaries and about a possible defensive armor developed after early loss. There were precise descriptions of techniques used and a few procedural notes about family therapy sessions. For the staff, the interventions had been small rituals of management rather than change. Rosa read some of the reports at the kitchen table, the paper rough beneath her fingertips, and felt a mixture of sympathy and a weary recognition of how expertise sometimes forgets the human body that lives inside a diagnosis. In technical terms, they had conducted assessments, behavioral exposure plans, and progressive socialization steps. In practical terms, the house stayed large and Sophie stayed distant. The failure of solutions left a pressure that settled like dust in corners, and the house collected well-meaning attempts like trophies no one wanted to claim. Rosa found Sophie in the upstairs sitting room on a weekday afternoon, a place where the sunlight came in through tall windows and made dust motes hang like tiny islands. There was a box tucked under the chaise, taped with faded masking tape, and a stack of folded clothes that seemed carefully untouched. Sophie sat with her back straight, a posture of someone who was always ready to be observed. Rosa moved slowly so as not to startle, and she carried a tray with a small bowl of warm broth she had brought from the kitchen. The first words were small and careful. "Hello," Rosa said, her voice gentle like the turning of a page. Sophie did not look up. "You must be the new person," Sophie said, the sentence wrapped in politeness and a barrier. "I am Rosa," Rosa answered. "I just started. I made some soup. It is warm." Sophie studied the spoon, but did not reach for it. "I do not eat house food," Sophie said. "I do not eat what is not mine." Rosa set the tray down on a low table and sat on the floor, crossing her legs in a way that made her level with the girl. "May I sit?" she asked. "You may stay there," Sophie replied, a line that did not invite. Rosa held silence like a tool and did not try to fix. "When I was a child," Rosa said after a while, "there was a place where we got soups like this. It tasted different depending on who made it. One woman used more salt. Another added a leaf that made me laugh." Sophie looked at her finally, a flicker of interest. "Why would you tell me that?" Sophie asked, suspicious. "Because food tells stories," Rosa said, "and because I was wondering if you like certain stories." Sophie's next words were sharper. "I do not like stories about poor people." Rosa let the sentence fall. "Then tell me about the stories you like," she suggested. Sophie named museums and travel and champagne evenings, and Rosa listened, turning those objects into threads without judgment, only curiosity. "Do you ever think about where you came from?" Rosa asked gently. Sophie blinked. "Of course," she said with a practiced confidence. "I came from here." Rosa did not contradict her. She reached slowly into the bag by her side and took out a small, battered notebook and set it beside the box under the chaise. The notebook smelled faintly of mildew and glue. "Sometimes a person does not know that the place they came from is a story someone else holds," Rosa said. Sophie felt irritation ripple. "Are you trying to teach me humility?" she asked. "No," Rosa said. "I am trying to share a memory." The air hummed with the invisible work of two people beginning to orbit each other. They spoke for a long time, 8 exchanges at least, a rhythm that grew into 10, with pauses, with laughter that surprised both of them, and a silence that settled like a blessing. The room described itself in sound and shadow. The bowl steamed softly. The fabric of Sophie's dress made a small sound when she shifted. The clock in the hallway ticked measuredly. Outside, a car passed, leaving a faint trace of city dust. The first scene of connection opened like a door a fraction. It was not dramatic. The first bite came slowly. Rosa had prepared a spoon of broth with a little toasted bread softened inside. She did not command Sophie to eat. She held out the spoon and said, Try a small taste. If you do not like it, we will stop. Sophie looked at the spoon as if it were a puzzle. Her fingers trembled when she took it. The broth touched her lip and warmth moved into her chest. "It is salty," she said. "It tastes like the sea," Rosa said with a small laugh. "It tastes like someone adding care." Sophie swallowed, and then another spoonful. The house held its breath. The sound of spoon against bowl was tiny but enormous. Carlos in the kitchen paused with a ladle in his hand. Sandra felt something like disbelief and hope knot together. Miguel put down a trowel. Daniel rolled back into the corridor to listen, and Eliza paused mid-note to let the moment settle. When Sophie ate a third spoonful, the room seemed to shift its angle, like a painting slightly tilted into a warmer light. Tears pricked Sophie's eyes, surprising both of them. "Why would that make me cry?" she asked, puzzled. "Because it is both simple and kind," Rosa said, "and because sometimes things are too small to be noticed until someone points them out." Their dialogue expanded, 8 to 10 exchanges with long pauses and small confessions. The textures of the broth, the sound of the spoon, the faint smokiness of the toasted bread, the weight of the bowl on the table, the way sunlight warmed Sophie's knees, the soft scrape of Rosa's cardigan as she leaned forward, all marked the scene with sensory notes. When she finished the bowl, Sophie pressed her palm to her chest and whispered, "I remember a smell." Rosa nodded and took out the battered notebook and the twine folder. "Would you like to see something?" she asked. When Sophie opened the folder, the air altered. There were photos, some black and white, some with edges chewed by time. At the front was a picture of a small anonymous room and a young woman holding a baby. The young woman wore a shawl, and under the shawl the baby's face was peaceful and unclaimed. Sophie's first reaction was that of someone inspecting a relic. The second was a bolt of something that went straight through her chest. "Who is this?" she asked. Rosa guided her hand to a faded pencil notation on the back of the photograph. "The shelter kept records in a stack," Rosa said. "People left names, and sometimes they kept nothing. The woman who left that name worked in a factory after. She wrote letters sometimes." Sophie read the name aloud and then stopped. The name matched an old note Sophie had never shown anyone, a scribble her mother had left in a locked drawer. The revelation hit like a small clandestine lamp switching on in a dark room. Sophie's breath came fast. "This cannot be," she said. The toasted revelation was a pivot. It was a passage through shame into a new kind of recognition. The dialogue in this moment turned inward and outward, 8 exchanges, voices tight and soft, each sentence loaded. The photographs smelled faintly of dust and soap. Rosa's fingertips traced the edge of a photograph and left a small oily print. The afternoon light slanted and made the paper glow. Outside, a dog barked, a sound that seemed to anchor the house to the rest of the city. In that room, Sophie's identity unraveled a fraction and rewove into something with edges she did not yet recognize. The moment was a discovery not of scandal but of belonging previously denied. Harrington returned at dusk. He had the look of a man carrying documents and regret in equal measure. When he learned Sophie had eaten in the afternoon, he stopped in the hallway as if he had mistaken his destination. "She ate?" he asked, voice a mixture of fear and unspent hope. "Yes," Rosa said simply, "she had a little broth." Mr. Harrington's face moved through stages, guarded, startled, then an almost unthinkable relief. "You fed her?" he demanded, voice brittle. "We shared food," Sophie said, protective and calm in a new way. "This is not about feeding," Mr. Harrington said, trying to wrap a policy of care around something tender. "It is about rules," he added, as if rules could have contained the small miracle. Rosa watched him with a quiet steadiness. "Sometimes what people call rules are just ways to keep from seeing each other," she said. The conversation in the sitting room became a circle of accusation and revelation. Sophie confronted her father about the absence of her mother and about the silences. Mr. Harrington opened his hands and offered an apology that had been rehearsed and therefore human. The exchange expanded into 10 verbal turns, with long suspensions where none of them spoke, only listened. The father read from a file of adoption and hospital records with trembling fingers. He had always thought the truth was a closed box to preserve status. Opening it made him small. "I never meant to hide this," he said. "I was trying to protect you, and I was afraid." Sophie's voice cracked. "Protect me from what? From knowing where I came from? That is the very thing I should have known." The confrontation forced him to reckon with choices that had been framed as care but had been avoidance. The room smelled of coffee forgotten and the metallic tang of paper. A clock chimed, and each note marked a small act of reckoning. In the end, Mr. Harrington sank into a chair and put his face in his hands, which was both a confession and a surrender. The routines that followed were careful work. Days were structured with small, deliberate tasks: carrying soup to the sitting room, folding a blanket the way a hospital nurse folds linen, reading aloud from a book Sophie had once loved but not touched in years, planting bulbs with Miguel in the edge of the garden where sunlight pooled in the mornings. Rosa taught by example. She taught how to arrange a table, not as statement, but as invitation. She made lists with Sophie and then tore them up when the lists became less important than a shared song. The household names multiplied into a community that acted out of attention. Sandra learned to soften schedules and allowed an extra hour for tea. Carlos started making a pot of broth on Saturday mornings and left it at the back door under the label, "We're keeping this for later." Miguel took Rosa's hand once when she needed steadying and found he liked the warmth there. Daniel brought home small things from errands the neighbors had left for the family and put them on the hall table like unspoken peace offerings. Eliza stopped correcting everything and began to ask questions instead. These days carried textures: the scrape of a spoon against a bowl, the rustle of newspaper that had been read aloud, the scent of basil in a kitchen that had once used only imported herbs. In the quieter evenings, Sophie began to tell pieces of her memory with a voice that trembled and then grew steadier. Rosa's backstory surfaced in these months not as a lecture, but as threads that Sophie used to stitch her own life into a new fabric. Rosa had been born in a small shelter on the outskirts of the city. She had smelled the iron of hospital rooms and the fresh linen of donations. She had learned to tie knots in ropes to mend nets, to hold babies while mother slept, to sew a button on a coat with a patience that taught her how to wait without losing faith. Her childhood had been a sequence of small protections built by strangers. Later, she had worked as a volunteer, making tea and reparations of tiny kindnesses. When she spoke of it, she named the sounds of a sleeping ward, the taste of kindness-shaped stew, the soft cardboard of donated books, and the way a donated blanket always smelled slightly of sisterhood. She had been a woman who had carried pain and named it softly. The backstory lingered around Sophie like a new scent and filled the house with human history rather than empty pedigree. Tension returned in several sharp ways. The first moment came when a journalist knocked at the gate, smelling a story and the revelation about Sophie's origins. They wanted to write a headline about a rich girl with a hidden past. Sophie recoiled at the idea of being exhibited. The second came when a cousin from the other side of the family accused Mr. Harrington of jeopardizing their reputation by admitting the truth. The third was a private night when Sophie woke in a panic and could not remember the face of the mother she barely knew. Each moment was a pressure point. In the first, Sophie faced the choice between privacy and public rectification. She stayed up and wrote a letter that was both a refusal and an invitation, choosing how to tell her own story. In the second, Mr. Harrington had to stand up to a family that valued image over truth. He found himself for the first time choosing his child over a ledger and a dinner table full of people who would not understand the nuance of shame. In the third, Sophie sat by the window and let herself call Rosa's name, because Rosa had become the thing that anchored her to now. These moments were short bursts of crisis, about 550 characters each in their weight and consequence. They contained images of a headline in a newspaper, printing black on white, of a cousin's hand slamming a leather folder on the table, of Sophie's hands finding the hem of her nightshirt in the dark. The tensions did not undo months of small change, but they tested its strength. Each time the household found a way to respond by turning toward honesty, by making space for feelings that were messy, by naming the fear and then sitting with it. They learned that truth could be both messy and liberating. The breakthrough was not only emotional. There were procedural steps that needed attention too. Hospital records had to be requested from archives, social workers contacted, and legal documents reviewed. Rosa and Mr. Harrington sat with a small packet of hospital notes that had been archived and filled out the request forms with care. They called a social worker named Elena to confirm dates and gently asked for a record search. The process required signatures, a few phone calls, and a formal request for sealed files. They described the steps simply so Sophie would feel secure. Contact the hospital archives, complete the form, wait for a response which might take 2 to 4 weeks, and then arrange a meeting in a neutral place with the social worker present. The technical description was precise but accessible, and it gave Sophie a vocabulary to understand her origin without the fog of rumor. The household learned that procedures could be allies when wielded with tenderness. The medical notes turned out to be plain and bureaucratic. The shelter had recorded a birth and listed a first name and a single line that matched the note Sophie had kept in a drawer. The legal steps to recognize the record and to place it in family files were a matter of signatures. The emotional steps were ongoing. Community responded in small movements. Neighbors who had once whispered began to bring small jars of preserves and left them on the hall table. The local shelter where Rosa had been born sent a letter asking if the family would consider supporting a space for mothers who had no one. Sophie agreed at first with a tentative voice, and then with an easing that surprised her. She walked into that shelter one afternoon under Miguel's escort and smelled soup and laundry hung to dry, and voices that were warm and immediate and unvarnished. The people there did not look at her as a headline. They smiled like they'd recognized someone who had been away and was returning. "I did not know how to belong," Sophie said to a room that had chairs and mismatched cups and a wall painted in peeling blues. "I mocked things I did not understand because it made me feel safe." A woman named Lorraine held her hand and said, "You are here now." The community offered stories of resilience rather than pity. That was a pivotal moment where Sophie stopped performing disdain and began asking questions about history and kindness. The change was not sudden but consistent. The house began to open more windows. Carlos began a Saturday stew that he called the Remembering Pot. Eliza started a library with books donated by neighbors. Sandra taught a sewing circle. Miguel and Rosa started planting a small vegetable patch by the garage. Each act was small and practical and smelled of soil and a kind of everyday reverence. A romantic thread grew quietly and felt true because it was based on mutual respect and shared labor. Miguel and Rosa had spent countless afternoons kneeling in the soil together and had developed a soft language of looks and small jokes. They had long conversations that started as practical exchanges about irrigation and ended with confessions about childhood fears. One evening, after a rain that left the air cool and fresh, Miguel stopped in the doorway of the greenhouse. "I cannot imagine you leaving," he said simply. "I do not want to leave," Rosa answered. They looked at each other like two people admitting they had been keeping a light under a bucket. The conversation that followed had 10 exchanges or more, full of pauses and laughter, of recalling the first time they had found a snail shell in the mud, of Rosa admitting that she had once been too frightened to name her own name loudly, of Miguel confessing that he had planned to ask her to move into the cottage behind the gardener's shed. The moment of proposal came softly. Miguel knelt in the damp grass and took Rosa's hand. He did not have a diamond or a fancy speech. He had a ring from a market, a small band because his pockets were modest and because the band bore an inscription in a different language that meant together. "Will you stay and be my partner in this small life?" he asked. The greenhouse smelled of wet earth, of rosemary, and a floral sweetness that seemed to conspire with his words. Rosa said yes, and the sound of her affirmation felt like something folding into place. The confrontation that had worried everyone was not a physical fight, but a moral reckoning. A cousin who had represented the family's interests in society attempted to leverage the origin story into a scandal, threatening to sell a version of the tale to a magazine for money. The family had to choose between protecting reputation and owning truth. Sophie stepped forward with a clarity that surprised even her. "This is my story," she said in a statement that she wrote herself and read to those close to her. "I will tell it as I live it." The household rallied around her with statements of support that were practical and steadfast. Rosa wrote a letter about the shelter and what it taught her about people as opposed to positions. Miguel and Carlos stood by Sophie in public ways, small and large. The tension resolved not because of public relations, but because of a decision to live openly and to invite accountability where it was due. A month later, everything felt both very different and very ordinary. Sophie had begun to volunteer twice a week at the shelter. The mansion had more laughter at midday and fewer formal dinners at night. The community garden behind the house produced tiny carrots that tasted like triumph. Sophie had cut her hair short in a way that made her look younger and more sincere. There were 3 rituals that marked this first month. Sophie's letter posted to the staff where she thanked them by name. A small dinner where the entire household ate together without ceremony and with vegetable stew. And a quiet visit Sophie made to the hospital archives to hold the papers that had once been just records. The month smelled of rain and citrus from the kitchen and felt like the first warm day after a long winter. Sophie had shed some of her mocking tone and learned to ask questions instead of making judgments. The shelter named a small reading corner after Rosa's early mentor, and Sophie donated a set of new blankets. The father began attending dinners without checking his watch. They all breathed in a tentative rhythm of repair. 3 months later, the household had a different architecture of care. Sophie had constructed a partnership with the shelter to fund a workshop that taught trades to young women. The mansion's gates opened more often. The vegetable patch had grown into a small orchard of herbs and fruit. Miguel and Rosa had moved into the gardener's cottage, and the sound of their morning cooking drifted pleasantly into the east lawn. Sophie's relationship with her father had improved, though not untroubled. They had negotiated therapy sessions together and forged new rituals of honesty that included a weekly walk where they spoke without counsel taking notes. The community noticed the mansion's shift and began to feel it as a generous presence rather than an aloof neighbor. There was a small public event in the shelter where Sophie spoke about her journey, and the room was full not of reporters, people who cared. The air of that evening smelled of frying onions and sugar from a communal dessert, and Sophie's voice shook once and then steadied. She read a passage from Rosa's battered notebook about the language of kindness. In the months that followed, more families reached out to ask how to support local shelters without making them into spectacles. The change was not immediate for everyone, but it was visible and durable. 6 months in, the transformation had grounded into something longer lasting. Sophie and the family sponsored a new wing at the shelter to offer counseling and a small library. Mr. Harrington had begun a modest foundation to support family reunification programs and had begun to speak publicly about the dangers of hiding histories. Rosa and Miguel had a small celebration in their cottage, and Carlos cooked a meal that mixed the mansion's silver with the comfort of kitchenware that had been used for generations. Sophie had become an active steward of the community projects and had found a voice that was both vulnerable and firm. She had reconciled her early embarrassment into advocacy. The mansion's rooms felt less like museum pieces and more like places that housed living things. The garden had a small plaque with the names of neighbors who had helped. The shelter had a new reading corner with books that smelled like possibility rather than donation. The epilogue of 6 months showed people meeting each other not as roles but as humans. There were small rituals, a breakfast where Sophie served toast to her father, a trip to the market where she carried bags without an attendant, a ceremony where the shelter unveiled a mural painted by children who had been helped by the programs. The air of that season tasted of citrus and coffee and the satisfaction of hard work. The legacy was not only in programs created, but in the way the family learned to be in public with humility and in their willingness to let their story be one of repair rather than performative charity. If you are feeling the knot in your chest now, know that this is normal and valid. Share in the comments if you have ever discovered something about your own past that changed how you saw yourself. Write yes and a brief sentence if you were helped by someone unexpected or if you have ever found belonging in an unlikely place. Your words can help someone who is watching and needs to know they are not alone. The community of people who read these stories becomes a shelter of its own when we speak honestly. Now go back with me to the last evening where the family stood in the garden and a simple decision sealed 1,000 small acts of care. In the courtyard, under string lights that made the gravel twinkle, the family and staff gathered for a modest party. There was no grand speech, only small toasts. Mr. Harrington held Sophie's hand as if to anchor himself to a truth he was still learning. "Thank you," he said to Rosa and to Miguel and to the staff who had become kin. Rosa answered softly, "We all needed to be seen." Miguel kissed Rosa's forehead and offered an invitation to continue a life built on slow labor and laughter. Sophie stepped forward and said, "I will not hide the beginning of my story. I will tell it because it belongs to me and because it connects me to others." She looked out at the small crowd and then at the photographer who had been invited for the shelter's archive and said, "Take one picture of us eating. Take one of us laughing. Take one of the plate with crumbs. These are the things that will hold us." The final image that lingers is the clink of a spoon and the murmur of voices merging into a companionship that is not fragile but real. If this story touched you, share it with someone who may need to know that beginnings do not define the only possible future. Subscribe for more stories of unexpected healers and quiet reconnections. In the end, what remained was not the mansion or the money, but the house as a place where people learned to make room for each other, and the sound that filled it was a simple and true thing, a laugh that had finally come home.